This week, the podcast is going on a bit of a break, and so what I'm going to be doing in this episode is basically just compiling all my mini episodes that I did across the past 6 weeks, and yeah, that will be the episode for quote-unquote this week. This is just a bit of an in-between episode so I can get back on my feet to get used to the normal length episodes that we usually do, and yeah, so I will see you next week. I hope you do enjoy this. If you haven't listened to these podcast episodes, I really enjoyed making these across the past 6 weeks, and I put a lot of work into them, even though they were mini-sodes per se. Because I can't mention these things in the podcast because they're pre-recordings, if you do enjoy this episode, it would be lovely if you could leave it a review, especially if you really enjoyed the mini-sode series or you just enjoy this podcast in general and you want to support it. That is the way to do so. If you could leave a review on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you can leave reviews, that would help out a ton. So let's get into the mini-sodes of the past 6 weeks. This first one is part 1, where I speak about the animation of Yutaka Nakamura and Norio Matsumoto. I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Guess in the Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Guess in the Mecha, and in today's episode and the first of our mini-sode series, which I'm going to be talking about the animators which I really like and kind of inspire me. This week we're going to be talking about the animation of Yutaka Nakamura. Yutaka Nakamura is probably one of the most popular, if not the most popular animator in the anime space at the moment. Mostly for their action animation, from everything from the tram scene in Cowboy Bebop to their most recent and very explosive animation within My Hero Academia. So what exactly makes their animation so engaging? I've reduced it down to 3 very key features. First off is the way of which they use smears, these extensions of movements and effects. To me, Nakamura often treats their visual effects with this very sharp, razor-type look. They spread outwards and they also point very outwards too. Extending the effects or the movement often creates a sense of speed and also pressure as well. If we have something like lava or fire which is emerging from the ground, the way in which Nakamura would smear it is that it appears as if it's bursting out of the ground, and I feel like that creates much more aggression as opposed to if it was not plunging out of the ground like the way in which he animates it. Also, by smearing subjects and characters in this way, it appears as if they are whizzing past the camera in a way which the camera can't really handle. It's not overly done, but it's moving slightly faster than it maybe should be, and this is a really great visual illusion created by Nakamura. Impact frames are also a very big part of Nakamura's action animation too. Usually, from what I've seen, their impact frames are used to represent some sort of activation, be it of a power, like my favorite examples would be Izuku or Deku's One for All power, or Jiro's power within Concrete Revolution. They're often highly contrasting in terms of color, using either black and white or red and black occasionally, and also appear very raw a lot of the time when they are in black and white, or sometimes even quote-unquote black and yellow, because they're contrasting the pencil lines to the paper, and a lot of the time we're able to see pretty much the paper if you're pausing through each frame. You can see the pencil lines and the paper, and it appears much more raw and quite authentic. And then finally we have cubic or cubic-esque debris. I say cubic-ish or cubic-esque because not every bit of debris that Yutapon animates is exactly a cube, but it takes the form of a cuboid or something similar. It breaks the natural order of what we understand as debris. Debris is often seen as irregular in how it breaks off, but when it breaks off in a form which has some sort of pattern or correlation, when you have multiple cubes of similar sizes breaking off a building, I think that makes it much more interesting to watch, as it highlights the strength of the characters and also how absurd the world in which they're in. It reminds us a lot of how some of these stories are quite detached from realism. They can also be used for transport as well. Not in the way that you think, but often or sometimes they're used to progress fights or to progress some sort of action. And I think that that is a really smart way of integrating something that not only looks cool, but also functions very well for its purpose, which is to create an engaging fight. So what can we learn from Nakamura's animation? For many of us, this was an introduction to the crazy world of action animation in anime, and it was an amazing introduction as well to many of these techniques, such as smears or impact frames, or debris and how it can be animated. The work of Nakamura is an excellent gateway into those starting to learn about Japanese animation and what it's all about. It's not the entirety of it, and I recommend looking further beyond it, like I would with any other animator, but I think that this is a great place to start, as I'm sure that Nakamura's animated probably one of your favorite fight scenes within anime. Nakamura also helps us a lot learn how influence works, as many action animators today have been inspired by Nakamura himself. When one is able to look into how other animators have delved into and used parts of the Nakamura toolkit, if you want to call it that, we can notice how this industry is so connected and how different anime, although might come from, say, different studios or from a different set of animators, this industry is very interconnected, and I think that the work of Yutaka Nakamura teaches us that this industry is much more connected than we might have thought. I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Guess in the Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Guess in the Mecha, and in today's episode and the second minisode in our short intro 2 series where I look at animators that really inspire me and I really like in terms of their work, this week we are talking about none other than the action animation of Norio Matsumoto, so let's get into it. It would honestly be a disservice to the anime space and of course Norio Matsumoto if I wasn't to mention him when it comes to action animation. Not because Norio Matsumoto is the pioneer of action animation or something, but they play such a massive part in what it is today and how a lot of us, at least people of my age, understand it. It would truly be criminal to talk about action animation within anime across the past 30 years without mentioning Matsumoto. I think Matsumoto, similarly to Yutaka Nakamura, teaches us a lot about these fundamental parts of action animation and many parts which we take for granted. And by watching Norio very closely, you start to realize that this is why I understand these things to such a level and why I enjoy them so much. From their splendid fights in Hunter x Hunter 1999 and their iconic work in Naruto Part 1, the one which most people know being Naruto vs Sasuke, phenomenal fight by the way. What really continues to amaze me is how Matsumoto is so daring in their handling of characters. For the sake of showing an extra level of speed, they'll willingly tear apart the character, and a great example of this would be in Hunter x Hunter 1999, one of their most famous cuts, where Gon is running, and what they'll do is that they'll quite literally take apart Gon when he's trying to run, and he'll do that with the other characters chasing them too, and they'll smear them endlessly in order to just get that effect of speed that's necessary. They're able to take characters and really, and quite literally bend them to his will by bending and stretching them with these smears. They have these sort of elastic type smears when they run, and honestly, I think that is what makes Matsumoto's animation so iconic, partially because, again, similarly to what we spoke about last week with Yutaka Nakamura, they can be so recognizable at times. I would say today, because they do a bit less action work, they're not as recognizable, but when it comes to the fighting, you can just tell that this is what Matsumoto's all about, because they introduce us again to smearing as a concept, and they really take it as far as possible in order to meet the brief of which they're trying to get to within the fight which they're animating. If we go back to Naruto Part 1 for a second, one of my favorite moments and demonstrations from Matsumoto is the fight between Sasuke and Orochimaru in the Forest of Death. This is so good for Orochimaru especially because it ties in so well with the nature of their character. As I said, this elastic-like look to Matsumoto smears and effects by almost bending the character and squishing them in a way, not exactly squash and stretch, which you would get from more traditional animations in the 20th century, but I more mean pulling them outwards to kind of show movement and acceleration. Again, this fits so well with a character like Orochimaru, who is all slimy and constantly weaving around, and Matsumoto also has an excellent technique there and works so well for very specific anime because that fits in with what some of these characters are all about, and when these two things marry, it's truly extraordinary, and I love that in any anime, just like we spoke about last week. These things aren't exclusive to Matsumoto, but they introduced me to a lot of concepts when it comes to action, one of them being storyboarding, and this was quite a long time ago. Not to say I didn't know what storyboard was, but in the way that certain action animators board their own action in certain works, like Naruto has done in certain parts of Naruto movies, for example. Action choreography as a whole is very complex, and Matsumoto doesn't make it any easier particularly to understand, but at least they got me into the concept of it, and we can generally just take so much from action animators that take on the role of actually storyboarding and directing sequences, not only for themselves but for others too. They have a massive insight into how fighting works, and seeing that executed is also very interesting when something's executed within their vision, and overall Matsumoto introduced me to this too. Overall, Matsumoto's another great gateway animator, you could say, into fighting and action animation, but they're also one of the first animators generally that I really latched onto. They changed the way in which I view animation and generally just how fight choreography works, and just the concept of choreographing fights for an anime, which didn't really come to me unlike live action. They truly opened up my eyes to animation, and I honestly couldn't be more grateful. This is now part 2 where I speak about the animation of Naoya Nakayama as well as Shingo Yamashita. I'm Jamal and you're listening to Guess in the Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Get in the Mecha. In today's episode we are looking at the animation but also direction of a creative that I really like, and that is Naoya Nakayama. So let's get into their work. If I was to summarize Nakayama's work as briefly as possible, or say what it represents, it would really be this notion of if one is to focus so hard on one thing, they eventually master it, and they eventually become almost the best at it. And that is Nakayama pretty much. What has Nakayama necessarily mastered, you ask? And that is the anamorphic aspect ratio, these anamorphic widescreen aspect ratios, aka 21:9, or 235:1, or 2.39:1. They are so effective at both animating within it and also directing for it as well, and I think over time these skills have come, and they've, with all the projects they accept as you go through the list of their work, you notice that they constantly step up their game when they're working on it, since I think that they've really figured out how to use it. However, it isn't just the aspect ratio that they're animating in or working in, but it's really getting good at working at everything that comes all around it and bringing out the maximum potential of it. This is something we already try to speak quite deeply about on the podcast, and how aspect ratios within the 21:9 ratio are really good at kind of creating this impression that space is limited, even though technically it's a wider screen, so it isn't, but it creates the illusion of limitation. But even so, they're able to work within the limitations and bring out things that aspect ratios like 16:9 can't really bring. And yes, that's really Naoya Nakayama. They've really mastered all these things that come with the entire package rather than just animating within it in a very bog standard way. They've really gone above and beyond. Not to speculate too much, but based on their key animation work, which is very focused on anamorphic widescreen aspect ratios, I suspect that they've become quite informed by it, and that by constantly working on it has allowed them to get to a stage at which they've basically mastered it. It's not to say every single thing they've done in their entire career is done in 21:9, but by constantly working with it and hacking at it, you get to a stage, I think, where you really just get it and understand it's so familiar, basically. Great examples of this would be their work in Kaguya-sama, so the famous Chika dance, or the very cinematic moment with Mikoto Ino and Kaguya and Miyuki, and they're having a whole conversation, all these contrasting lights, and they're in the darkness too. It has such a beautiful look to it. And so how do they achieve this? They achieve this through this amazing color contrast that goes really well with when you're watching this on a screen that's relative to, say, 16:9. You get this amazing contrast between the bars and the screen, and I think that only brings out some of the colors, and the same applies to the Kage episode too. They seem to have picked up on all these very small things that I don't think most consider. So again, the color contrast, but also framing things as well. What works and what doesn't. A really great sort of safe frame that they often go for, but it's very effective, is the center frame and creating symmetry within that. And this really pays off when we look at their directions. So my personal favorite thing that they've directed and done storyboards for, and even done some key animation for, is a Salt Lily Bouquet. I really love how Nakayama takes advantage of these centerpieces, or just simply placing characters in center frame, and this works because when we have a much wider image, in a way that really brings out the horizon line, our eyes are kind of drawn to the center, because you have the horizon and then you have something in the middle to sort of disrupt the horizon, I think, and so you get this nice mini cross, and you usually see what's in the front, or at least that's kind of what I think I'm not saying this is a universal process, but I think that's my process when it comes to watching something in 21:9, and Nakayama really uses that to their advantage, to the point to which it just feels like they're so fluent in an aspect ratio. I never knew I was able to really say that, but this is one of the few creators that I genuinely think is what you could say fluent in a technique, or a technical part of anime. What can we learn from Nakayama? Every technical aspect comes with so many intricacies and aspects to consider. I think Nakayama can be quite an inspirational artist, and even just inspirational for us creatives when it comes to focusing on one thing. I think often creatives like to try to do so many things, but there's nothing wrong with being very specific and niche and trying a very specific thing, but doing it really well and getting very good at it. And I think Nakayama shows us that that works, and hence I find their work quite motivating on the basis of that, but also, again, it's some amazing stuff. In summary, it shows that focusing on specific things can come with some real merits. I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Guess in the Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Guess in the Mecha, and in today's episode we are looking at another creative that really inspires me and that I really like in terms of their work, and this time we are looking at none other than Shingo Yamashita. So let's get into it. As an animator who's famous for, if I'm just to list off some stuff like Tetsuo and Birdie Decode 2, to the very famous and arguably, even though I disagree, I did a whole episode on it, infamous part in Naruto Shippuden, and even going further to Yozakura Quartet Hoshi no Umi and their stuff on Full Metal Alchemist Sacred Star of Milos. They have a bunch under their belt. They've been doing this for a very long time. You'd really have to work your way into the 2000s if you want to start tracking their work. A lot of the reason why I love their animation so much is that they're always able to offer something fresh. A lot of the time, this quote-unquote fresh thing that I'm talking about is the way in which they distort the forms of their characters. They often have this extra fluidity to them, and they feel much more loose. He's really able to do some interesting things. If you go back to the Pain episode in Naruto Shippuden, you'd know exactly what I mean. And even if you just go to stuff like Tetsuo and Buddy Decode as well, and Full Metal Alchemist Sacred Star of Milos is just much more loose, and I find that quite enjoyable, to be honest. But also sometimes it's other things as well. It's like introducing cubic debris, which we did speak about when we were talking about Yutaka Nakamura, but I think Shingo Yamashita often goes for this at very selective times, and it's much more subtle as well. If you're watching Tetsuo and Beidika, literally in the first episode, I managed to spot it, but it's much smaller, and it's also a bit more inconsistent. It's not to the same consistency. When I say consistency, I mean as in the size and how they break off as others, but that is also what makes them an amazing animator and director. They're always able to add their spin on something and it becomes their own, rather than it falling into the image of someone else's tool. To some, their animation can look quite unusual, especially when they don't have many restraints, but I can also understand why people love this, and I love this because they're such a big eye-opener to what exactly animation can be, and I'm so grateful for that. I think every so often when you are looking at directors or animators, there's one that comes along that doesn't do things in the conventional way or in things that you can already expect. And those are the creatives that I think really change your view of anime and things like that, because they change the meta that existed in your head. What you thought something wasn't what it actually was, or they're able to spin that on its head, and it really opens your eyes. And Shingo Yamashita, not just on Naruto Shippuden, but mostly on Tetsuo and Buddy Decode and Tetsuo and Buddy Decode 2, really taught me that. And I think that's why I've decided to even do episodes like this, because I'm just much more interested in what animation can be in all these different styles, and Shingo Yamashita really brought that out for me. Just when you think that Shingo Yamashita can't offer any more, besides completely changing how I view animation, they did. And in this case, they have an amazing portfolio when it comes to their direction, and their directional talent is honestly stunning. Directing one of my favorite, if not my favorite anime of 2020, Pokemon Twilight Wings, alongside, and directing both in 2020 and 2021, Jujutsu Kaisen's first and second openings. These are internet-breaking openings that I don't even need to break down for you guys to really understand what I mean by Yamashita is just really a legend on his own, to be honest. Even if he hasn't animating, though, his style often shines through the things he directs on, not just from a directional aspect, but from an animation aspect too. I find that the key animator choices, but also the animation director choices are very in sync with the things that we've even seen from his own animation work. From the stuff of Nakaya Onsen, famous for the Onsen Shin in opening 1, to Kenichi Kutsuna as well in OP2, who's famous, if I was talking about the biggest thing they're famous for, it's their lightning technique and style of animating that. That fits very much in line with the Yamashita philosophy of just changing things up and distorting things. And I think that fits very well with what Yamashita tries to present to us and what he already does in his animation. They're very effective in embracing these unusual forms, be it through the handling of blood and water and fire, as I said as well, the Onsen Chin, and there's also a massive knack for detail as well in some places. If you go all the way back to Tetsuo and Buddy Decode 2, there's a very specific scene where I think Yamashita really reached their, I don't want to say they were in their bag as an animator, but they really everything kind of came full circle there when it comes to detail, but also timings and everything. And so I basically, what I'm trying to say is that Shingo Yamashita isn't the typical creative that you come across in this large anime industry. Yamashita as a director and also an animator has just gone all out across the past decade, and every time they really managed to amaze me by doing things that I didn't think that people would usually do and just going outside of that. In very cheesy terms, I think that they're just really good at thinking outside of the box, which is very effective for anime and fiction, which is constantly doing that, and having all these things you need to represent that we wouldn't be representing in real life. And thinking outside the box is very necessary when it comes to form and directing and all these things, and Yamashita really taps into that. And finally, Yamashita also teaches us as a director that, similarly to Nakayama as we said last week, mastering a specific thing can be very handy. They've almost mastered short form, as we spoke about in this episode with openings and ONAs, and they've just really managed to refine the approach, which is, from what I'm seeing, probably one of the best ways to really make a name for yourself in this anime industry, this very competitive one. In summary, Yamashita teaches us that refinement is important, but also going outside of what we consider conventional as well can be amazing for evoking new emotions and portraying things even better than we once thought. And so this is the final part where I speak about the animation of Yoshimichi Kameda as well as Keishiro Watanabe. I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Guess in the Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Guess in the Mecha, and in today's episode and in the 5th installment of the short intro to series, I'm going to be taking a look at another animator that I'm really into and their work, and this time that is Yoshimichi Kameda. So let's dive into their work. So how exactly was I introduced to Kameda's work? I discovered Kameda's work through an anime that I watched quite early into my anime watching career, and that was Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood. And generally I've really gravitated to their work because of the Fullmetal Alchemist franchise as a whole, mostly being within Sacred Star Milos as well as Brotherhood, because I'm not sure Kameda features on the other two. But what really shocked me was how different their stuff was relative to what I understood of what anime was. Do note that obviously when I was watching Fullmetal Alchemist Brotherhood, not particularly Star of Milos because I watched that only recently, but at least with Brotherhood, this was something that was still very much an introduction to me. I don't think I really dove into what this meta had to offer. So seeing this style of animation was something that I was completely unaware and oblivious to, but it also led me down a very wonderful rabbit hole that is the Kaneda School of Animation. Conventional or not conventional, there's historical precedent for the work of Kameda. And a lot of, as I said, a lot of his work comes or is rooted in the Kaneda School of Animation, which goes back almost about 4 decades and still has multiple animators, and not just Kameda, who adapt and use this style for presenting what they wish to portray. I'm no anime historian, and there are way better places to go if you want to research the work of Yoshinori Kaneda and those who have been influenced by him. But for a very, very snappy rundown of the Kaneda style, which is named after none other than the legendary animator Yoshinori Kaneda, it essentially revolves around this very frantic approach to animation and movement in general. It focuses a lot on where, this is going to be a way to explain, it snaps very quickly between stances. There are often these preemptive lines that showcase where the thing is going to move, and also kind of traces it as well. And I understand it's very hard to explain this in audio. I will probably put some links into the show notes if you want some better insight into it, because it is very hard to explain, but I think once you've seen Kamada, I'm sure you understand what I'm trying to get at. It also focuses a lot on exaggeration, and line weight often comes into it as well. Kamada would be a great example of this in Sacred Star of Milos, and even just some of his work. Generally, if you look at his stuff on My Hero Academia Heroes Rising, as soon as Kamada comes on the cart, the line weight increases because that's also his means of showing passion and potential anger and pain and just so many other things. So the lines are where the juice and the detail really is when it comes to Kamada and his adaptation of the Kannada school's techniques when it comes to animation. But where does Kamada speak into this? I don't want to get too carried away and talk about Kannada, and also I'm not too knowledgeable on it, so I'm not going to try and say that I know so much, but where does Kamada fit into this? And I think Kamada really does fit into this when it comes to using this as a base for their work. Not every cut from Kamada contains elements of the Kannada toolkit, but it's that underlying approach of Kannada revolving around spontaneity and exaggeration, and that informs so much of what Kamada is as an animator. Even if you go to his character designs of Mob Psycho 100, they might not particularly resemble that of the approaches to character designs and models which you've seen from Yoshinori Kanda in anime from the 80s and 90s, as well as the 70s as well, but it's the idea behind it. It's informed by spontaneity. It's informed by being quick to understand, as you get from Mob Psycho's character designs. When you see Reagan, immediately you kind of know what this guy is about from his facial expressions because of the line weight and so many other things. And I think that is what is great about Kamada. His approach is really clear, and you really get to understand what he's trying to do through very few things. From line weight alone, you can tell what he's already trying to portray. Furthermore, Kamada really likes to try and add to the style by adding elements that are more rooted in today. A great example would be his style of impact frames, which are something that we've seen around quite a lot, these contrasting black and white frames, and also other features as well. And so he's able to really refresh the style and give his own spin to it, even though it's been a style of animation for decades on end. Overall, Kamada teaches us a lot about influence and hybridity. Styles aren't just there to be taken one for one, but to be adopted and tinkered and used to one's advantage or how the artist sees fit. And this is something that this is a lesson that extends beyond Kamada, but I think Kamada is a great case study to start analyzing this. More specifically, this opens up this amazing vault of history as well when it comes to the legacy and impact of Yoshinori Kaneda, and Kamada was probably my first introduction to the Kaneda style, even though before I didn't realize it, and I would often dub this, the trigger aesthetic or something like that, without really knowing the history behind it. And I think Kamada was my gateway into learning why this style matters and how significant Yoshinori Kaneda is to anime, really, and this is something I'm still trying to learn about. Kamada's work is a testament to how the animation of yesterday still lives on in creatives today. I'm Jamal, and you're listening to Guess in the Mecha, your weekly anime and manga analysis podcast. From inspiring arcs to game-changing cinematography, I'm on a journey to try and make sense of it all, episode by episode. Enjoy the show. Welcome back to Guess in the Mecha, and in today's episode, and in the final episode of the mini-sode series, I'm going to be talking about another great animator that I really like, and one which I've been really enjoying recently, and that is the work of Keishiro Watanabe. So let's get into their work. Watanabe is an animator that I find kind of difficult to talk about, not because they don't have enough work, they have loads of it in their portfolio and a large variety of it. They have loads of it to analyze and discuss, but my challenge really is that it's hard to put your finger on what they're actually doing and why it looks so great. It's an issue which I've had with a few animators, and notably that of, say, like Shinya Ohira, for example. And you even see similarities within their work, but what's difficult is putting your finger on what they're doing and how they do what they're doing. And so this episode is maybe not going to be completely explanatory. This series was never this person's animation explained. I don't really want to try and explain it to you, just discuss it and enthuse over it. But I'm going to try my best to say what I think makes Watanabe a splendid animator in the landscape today. Based on their recent work, Watanabe fits in with a lot of animators that you might know from prior to their time, or even right now, people like Shinya Ohira, as I just mentioned, or Shinji Hashimoto, in how they handle characters. They handle them with a special sort of looseness, in terms of how they're constantly flailing around, they're constantly moving, they don't feel still, and I know animation is about movement, but I think you also have different degrees of movement. I don't even mean that within like timings. It's a very abstract thing which I don't even know if that has a name per se, but it constantly feels like they're active and alive. And Watanabe is just another animator that does this as well in such a splendid way. What I really like about their work is their unique sense of rhythm and tempo which their animation has, and this really came up in Jujutsu Kaisen, particularly episode 19 and 24, and they, I don't want to say they stole the show, but they really just had me wondering, like, how do they do it? And that's also what I really love about Watanabe. Watanabe in almost any show as of recent stands out because you're constantly, at least me, I'm constantly thinking as to how is this possible? How are they doing these things? And I think that's also what makes them really attractive as an animator as well. There's a sense of mystery behind their work, in my opinion. Watanabe thrives when it comes to altering the timings of their characters in terms of what they move on. For those that are new to timings, I know I do explain this every so often, but timings are essentially, or at least when we're talking about it in the context of anime, it's how many unique drawings are they using? We're not including in between frames, but how many keyframes is the key animator using out of the 24, and how many of those are unique? If they are using 12 out of, say, the 24, we often label that as 2s. If they're using 24 out of the 24 in every frame that's in a second, we'd often refer to that as 1s, and you can probably figure it out as you divide the said number by 24. And in this case, Watanabe is able to really switch between 2s and 1s very rapidly. In Jujutsu Kaisen, quite a lot, they'll switch to animating on 1s for a very short period of time where, again, as I said, 1s being a unique drawing for every frame within the context of 24 FPS. That's a lot of drawings. And he'll do it for a very short period of time, and then they'll release it into something like 3s. I say release in quotation marks because it technically isn't a release, but it creates the illusion of this release because everything's going so almost smoothly and then it kind of just dissipates in a way. I know I'm throwing around a lot of words and ideas that potentially don't even make sense, but I think he just has a really interesting concept of momentum in his own head, and I don't think many animators have this, and that's why I really think his work stands out, because it's based on its own norms, it's based on its own ideas and framework. Maybe not obviously it's still rooted in animation and the meta of Japanese animation still, but it operates on such a different conceptual level to what we often see. It's about momentum and releasing momentum rather than these other concepts which we've discussed in former episodes. Some would describe Watanabe's animation as chaos or chaotic, and I agree, but I also disagree. On the surface, and when it's fully in motion, I can definitely agree it screams chaos. But at the same time, I don't think it's also very productive to define it as that all the time, because I think there's a much deeper way of thinking about the way in which it ticks and how it operates. And I think chaos maybe takes away from that, because there are patterns amongst his work, especially Jujutsu Kaisen, which I'm returning to again as a great example of this. And I think we just have to try and dive into the mind of Watanabe. That's why I come back to the beginning and say that he's so difficult to figure out, or his work is so difficult to figure out, because it feels like it's just based on his own ideas, which sounds normal, but often, when we have, well, obviously, yeah, there is influence within the industry, and I'm sure Watanabe has those, but when it's based in very irregular norms of momentum and such, and releasing momentum, I think we have to try and dive into those patterns to really explore what makes Watanabe's pattern great, or Watanabe's animation great, rather than simply and only defining it as chaos. Why does Watanabe's work so well in Jujutsu Kaisen though? That's something I really want to get into. In the case of Jujutsu Kaisen, I think it's really good because tempo, rhythm, momentum, etc. relate so strongly to the notion of the athletic zone, which is really needed to understand the Black Flash which Akutami's crafted. And by interpreting the style in this way rather than calling it chaos, I think we can really dive deeply into how genius their choices are. Again, if we have an entire understanding of momentum within animation, we can very much understand what Akutami has been trying to portray and how Yuji has picked up momentum. He is in the zone and now he's ready to fight, which is such a big concept in the second half of Jujutsu Kaisen. Keiichiro Watanabe was almost the perfect animator for this project because his ethos and almost philosophy of animation, at least from what we can get from a viewer's perspective, fits exactly with what Jujutsu Kaisen is about, and so the two match almost perfectly. Watanabe is proof that in some cases, anime allows norms to be bent and even shattered entirely. That is obviously for debate, and I'm not saying he smashes every single norm to exist. There is some precedence there in other styles, such as that of Norio Matsumoto, and also that of, again, Shinya Ohira, Shinji Hashimoto. There's some linkage you can see there. But overall, I still think that, at least for a lot of newer viewers as well, and those that are newer to animation, this does feel quite norm-shattering. I think their work will also mark a change in how we discuss Japanese animation and how we need to adjust the way in which we think about it to better understand these styles and how we understand storytelling. In short, Keiichiro Watanabe reminds me that there's still so much more to learn and understand when it comes to Japanese animation. Thank you for listening to this mini filler-sode for this week if you did. Thank you for, again, supporting this series. And yeah, I will see you next week on the podcast. Hopefully doing normal episodes with episode 91 coming out next Friday. I have been your host Jamal today, and this has been Get in the Mecha. The music in this production goes as follows. Synthwave by Alex McCulloch. Mandatory Overtime by Joth. And Different by Chasers Gaming.